message to them. But anyway, let me start on this subject. Yes, sorry, this is me. Since I retired, I've become a professor. This explains why I'm saying the way I am about China. Sorry, the print is very small. But first of all, before I became a politician in the mid-90s, 30 years ago, I used to work for the multinational company Shell. I was in charge of scenario planning, economics. And we did a lot of work on the future of certain countries, including China. So I had to go and learn about it. Then secondly, we had a coalition government in the UK, the only coalition government since the war, Second War, when the Conservatives and the Liberals, my party, worked together. It was not a happy marriage, but we had to work together. And I was responsible for business, for trade, and general economic policy. And one of my tasks was to negotiate with some of the big emerging economies, China, India, Brazil. Also, I'm afraid Russia, no longer a friend, but we did then. And then there was a period when I worked in Africa with Nigerians, looking at China's involvement in Africa. And then finally, since I retired from Parliament, I've been working on China, and I produced a book called The Chinese Conundrum, which addresses many of these issues. The next question is why China matters. It's massively big economically, maybe first, maybe second biggest economy after the United States, but about the same as the United States. And therefore important for trade. I think it is your biggest trade partner. You export a lot of your grain to China. The overseas investment, technology, they steal a lot of technology, but they are also very advanced in the green technologies, electric cars, wind power. They are the best in the world. Also telecommunications. And they're potentially important for you because of reconstruction. Secondly, China and the United States, the rivalry, the competition, it dominates geopolitics. And for the Americans and the Chinese, their own dispute is more important than any other factors. So the Americans regard the Ukraine war as a distraction from concentrating on China, and the Chinese are very relieved that the Americans have been sucked into Ukraine, so they're not spending time confronting their nation. There is an anti-China consensus in America with Biden and the Republicans. And in Europe it's more ambiguous. The French and Germans are quite more neutral between China and other countries. But of course you have this problem that China and Russia have signed this agreement that they are friends forever, which is very threatening to you. And then thirdly, China has a very big influence in what we now call the global south. This is China, India, Brazil, South Africa, South America, Indonesia, all these countries, which have been ignored, but are now becoming a very powerful part of the world economy. This group called the BRICS, which China is a powerful player, very important for organizing opinion in the United Nations, and very important economically. And these are mostly anti-Western. The rhetoric, anyway, is anti-West. But we must not ignore them. They're very powerful, increasingly. And this is a chart I'm trying to show the size of different economies, right? Now this is the United States. Now the blue is the way we normally measure the size of economies, the GDP. But there is another way, the grey, where the GDP is corrected for different levels of prices. If you have a dollar in America, you buy less than a dollar can buy in China or India. So if you make this change, China has the biggest economy in the world, and then the European Union, and then India. India is becoming a very, very big economy. In 20 years, they will be probably number 3 in the world, and then Japan, Brazil, Indonesia, UK. It's about economic size. Not necessarily good or bad, but big and small. And this is the history, just the economic history. This is from 1820, 200 years ago, to the present time. Now China, for thousands of years, hundreds of years, was the biggest economy in the world, by a long way. They had 100 million, 400 million people. It was actually quite a developed place. But they declined, period of war, civil war, but are now coming back very fast. India also was the number 2 economy. It was under British rule, not very good for their economy. Declined, now recover. The UK reached a peak about 1914, but now in relative decline. The United States, until recently the biggest economy in the world, but now relatively declining, and Japan also has been through that stage. So it's important to look at the historical context, not just today. Now, there are different ways of looking at the world, different world views. So people are often talking at cross purposes, as we put it. The Chinese view is that the United States is in decline. The American view is that they are doing well, and they're also leading a new movement called the Global West, that all the free countries of democracies and free enterprise are all on side. So it's a different view of the world. The Americans think that the Chinese are assertive, aggressive, and the Chinese view is they're not, but that the Americans are trying to stop them from rising. The Chinese talk about territorial integrity, which is why they should be supporting you. And the Americans talk about self-determination, which is supporting the rights of minorities to break away in different countries. Say Taiwan, Hong Kong, they're different, but the principle of self-determination. Taiwan is obviously a big flashpoint. The Chinese say it's part of China. The US says it's more independent, it should be defended, it's more democratic. There is emerging a different approach to trade since President Trump. Trade is no longer seen as a good thing in America, more protectionist, whereas the Chinese are trying to dominate world trade. They are the biggest trading country in the world by a long way now. But in both cases, national security is a big factor in deciding what can be imported and what can be exported. There are different views of human rights. The American view and Ukraine view, British view, is human rights is about democracy, free speech, The Chinese view of human rights is different. They say those things are not important. What is important is fighting poverty and education and health. These are the things that matter. And the Western view, the American view, is that there are universal values that everybody in the world should believe in. Freedom, these human rights factors. And the Chinese do not accept that. They say what matters is our national sovereignty. We are free to do what we want in our own country. So there is a basic misunderstandings, different use of language, which explains why we are now getting what sometimes people call a new Cold War, based on these different ideas. Now, the question important for you, I think, is this whole question about the Russian-Chinese friendship without limits. And it is certainly, if you are a Ukrainian, I think you will be very angry that the Chinese use Russian propaganda. They use the same arguments. But it's a more, I think anyway, a more subtle, more detailed point. First, it's not an alliance. The Russian-Chinese view of the world is very different. I think Putin is about destruction, what I would call a wrecking ball, aggressions, fighting, destruction. The Chinese view is about preserving order. They like to win wars by not fighting. And they hate disorder. So they're trying to promote their interests non-militarily. So it's a very different approach from the Russians. The Chinese are so far not sending weapons to Russia. Small arms maybe, but not big weapons, no drones, no missiles. They've refused Putin's demand for new gas pipelines. They refuse to accept Russia claims to Crimea, Donbass. They say this is not legal. They haven't accepted it. They regard this as part of Ukraine still, rightly. They have what they call red lines. They're very frightened of nuclear accidents. So they are involved in the efforts to prevent the big nuclear plants in South Ukraine being damaged. They've suspended loans from a big international bank that they control. They act independently sometimes, and deep down there is a lot of suspicion. I've been quite a lot to Russia, and you find there is, amongst ordinary people and politicians, a lot of racism towards Chinese. They're afraid that the Chinese will take over and dominate them and to take their land. So it's not a comfortable relationship, right? You know, they say they're neutral, but they're actually pro-Russia. They're using Putin's propaganda, which is a problem. And another factor which is very important is that China isn't just one person. There is this very powerful dictator, President Xi, but actually China is very complicated, a massive country. There are different agencies, different factions, all with a different approach. So it's not just one single entity that we're dealing with. Okay, next one, it's got stuck.
1 second.
All right, this is my analysis of the impact of your war on the Chinese. Some people say, you know, this war is good for China. It certainly helps them. They're getting cheap energy from Russia. They're getting opportunities to sell exports to Russia. They dominate Russia economically. Russia is now very dependent on China economically. and it distracts the attention of the United States away from Asia, from Taiwan. It's useful from that point of view. And they are learning about American weapons, the use of sanctions. But I think the costs to the Chinese of this, your war, are actually much bigger. It's doing terrible damage to the reputation of China. The Europeans, the British, are very angry about the fact that the Chinese use Russian propaganda. It's not helping their reputation. It's mobilizing countries behind the United States. It's increasing support for Taiwan. It's also exposing Putin. Right? He's clearly a very wild, erratic, uncontrolled force, dangerous, also weak, potentially overthrown. The Chinese don't want instability, so they're worried about that. And it's doing economic damage because of the impact on energy markets and grain markets, you know, the Black Sea problem. So my judgment is that for them the costs are more than the benefits. Next one. Again, I'm stuck. Oh, sorry, this is very light here. But so the question I ask, which I think you answer, and I can't answer, which is what can China offer you, if anything? Maybe you don't want to have anything to do with them, but potentially there are things they can offer. Pro-Russian neutrality is better than helping them. They're not giving them weapons. That's a key difference. They do seem willing to act independently of the Russians over things like nuclear power safety. And they're big on trade. They were your biggest trade partner 2 years ago, in 2021. They have a lot of inward investment to put here. You may want them, you may not, but certainly in the UK we welcomed Chinese investments in areas like telecoms, though that's changed, the car industry and so on. And they you know, when they're good, they're good. I mean, they're good companies. And they will want an opportunity to help you with reconstruction. They have a lot of money, and they're very good at building infrastructure, very fast railways, roads, they're very good at that. But finally, remember, China now has some economic problems. They're getting into serious economic difficulties. I'll explain that. And the United States is not very happy at anything involving China. So you may have to choose one or the other. For example, when I was a minister, I was responsible for Huawei investing in telecommunications in the UK. And we were quite happy with them. We could manage the risk of surveillance and espionage. We thought we could manage it. But the Americans say, no, you can't have them. We don't want you. Go away. So the Americans told us, unless you expel Huawei, we will not supply you with important equipment. So we have to choose. You may have to choose. And then just to finally say a little bit about China's economy. Until very recently, China was the most successful economy in the world. Massive growth, 10% a year, enormous. Now the fast-growing economies are India and Vietnam. But then it was 10%, it slowed down to 5%, and now 2 to 3% after COVID. They all kind of weaknesses. They find it very difficult to get their consumers to spend money. There were very negative impacts of the COVID. There are very poor health services in China, so people have to save money for it, and they won't spend. And the party, the Communist Party, is exercising more and more control, so people don't have the freedom to choose as they want. There is an enormous misallocation of resources in economic terms, bad investments, wasting money, state enterprises that don't function very well. And now they have a big problem of debt. Property companies have gone bankrupt. Demography, China now has a declining population. They had 20, 30 years of what was called a one-child policy to stop overpopulation. But it was too successful, so most women now don't want babies. And the slowing of the population, the labor force is declining, so they no longer have people. I mean, they're running out of people in the labor force. And then finally, business lacks confidence because the government is interfering in lots of ways. They're very aggressive about corruption. Everybody is corrupt to some degree in Chinese business, so business people are frightened. So all of these things are producing a slow growth. And the big question now is China becoming like Japan, with very slow growth forever, or is this just a temporary fluctuation? I think it's more the second, but economists have a different view. So those are some. So I'm sorry I've taken so much time, but that's my analysis of the question. And before I sit down, I have a question to you to think about. I'd be interested in your views, which is, do you in Ukraine see China as mainly a threat, mainly an opportunity, or some mixture? I think that's a very important question you will have to answer in the next few years. I'll leave you to think about it. We'll discuss it later. Okay, thank you.
So our next speaker is, or maybe take some questions before. Maybe if anyone has questions to Vince.
We don't try here.
But we can maybe take 5-minute questions, a couple of questions.
We
now
can come back.
Yes, and then come back later. So if you have questions now, don't be shy.
I have a question.
Yes.
But later.
You want later? So we continue with next speaker is Valentyn Nalyvaichenko.
Something like that.
Yes. Thank you for pronouncing.
It's okay.
So you are a former head of the Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, and former ambassador at Belarus, and now you are in the parliament.
Yes.
And you are head of Interparliamentary cooperation with the European Union, and you are also a member of the United States cooperation.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. Do I need mic, or I can speak like without it?
You can speak with mic, maybe mic.
To record.
Yes.
Hello everybody. As I was introduced, my main occupation now is the Secretary for European Integration Committee in the Parliament, in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. And let me start with what we already enjoyed from the presentation, that from my experience, diplomatic experience, when I was responsible for bilateral relations Ukraine-China, we, I think, have to see and to find in our national interests, of course, those opportunities to get China engaged in anti-war coalition, at least, if not anti-Putin coalition. This in our national interests, like with our partners, with the United Kingdom. We have received a couple of weeks ago a delegation from your parliament in the Verkhovna Rada, with our partners, the United States and others, European Union, of course, among the first, but with our partners and superpower economies, same time, again, from your presentation and according to all the data, I think combining efforts with the United States and other partners, it's high time to work with China, to talk to China, to have their Ukrainian ambassador and Ukrainian embassy, active embassy and ambassador, and to start with very basic common points. First point, China used to be among the first countries recognized our independence. China signed the bilateral agreement recognizing us, all Ukrainians, as independent state and sovereign state. That's first point. Point number two, China, and I agree totally, Mr. Xi, leader of China, refused to sign with Putin this pipeline Siberia, Power of Siberia 2. No. Mr. Xi refused to provide lethal weapons to Russia, to Putin. Point number two. And sanctions policy and economic ties. This is where we, with the United States, with the United Kingdom, with Japan, and other countries can talk to Russia, to China, and with China to engage them in anti-war coalition. Anti-war coalition, what we need and what we highly need right now here in Ukraine and in the world. Of course, I agree, in the common interest, Ukraine and China's interest, is to be back to peace, to normal life. In a very simple terms, who wants the war in Ukraine, now in the world? Only one person. This is Russian dictator Putin. But why us all? I mean international partners, United Nations, other international organizations, and including China, why we should follow this absolutely suicidal dictator. No explanation, no ground, no even interest to do so, but for Ukraine and for our partners, it's high time to provide, let's say, introduce absolutely another agenda on the international level. Same time as we are now talking in this room, you know that Mr. Zelensky, Ukrainian president, now is at a meeting with the American President Biden, just now, at the same time. So I think that he is in Washington DC, and they are now, let's say, on bilateral meeting and talks, absolutely right now. And I know, as a member of the parliament and as a very active member of Ukraine, the United States French group, that bipartisan support in American Congress, and what is more important, the important support among Americans towards us, Ukrainians, towards Ukraine is very high. And according to the latest polls, up to 63 even % of Americans very supportive towards Ukraine and support our struggle on independence. And hate Putin, even more than 64%. This is why Mr. Biden, as American president, this is why American government and American Congress are very supportive towards us. And they'll, of course, support us as long as we need. But we need this time and these opportunities to be enlarged and engage China, Brazil, India, so global South, to be at the anti-war side, anti-war page, anti-war coalition, in order to stop Putin. Absolutely clear for everybody in this auditorium, I'm sure that next day China will at least limit economic ties with Russia. Next day Putin will be limited to conduct war against us, to kill our people, to shell us every night, like this night we again were under shelling of Russian missiles here in Kiev and around Ukraine, Cherkasy, Rivne, and other cities. So this is the high need, and as any optimist, I am as an optimist, see opportunities in any difficulty. This difficulty that China is not so, let's say, clear, is not so decisive to support us, means we should put as much effort as we could together with our international partners, to get anti-coalition enlarged and engage again, as I mentioned, China and other global South countries in anti-war coalition. Let me stop on that, not to take much of your time, maybe question and answers with Mr. Vincent. We are very ready and open to answer. Thank you.
Question, maybe we can take more questions. Maybe yes, Vitaly. Yes. Can you predict maybe and see in the future how long will be war, and who will be winner, and in economic maybe side, USA and West or China, after this war and maybe war in the West, Iran, Iraq, what this side?
Middle East.
Middle East, yes. Who win in economic, то економічно виграє в результаті?
Yes. Until very recently, almost everybody would say China becomes big number one, right, in the next 20, 30, 50 years. Right? But they're now having such economic problems that some people talk about peak China, in which case they will be roughly level to the United States for a long time. So there are two scenarios. I think it's inevitable, myself, that China will become the dominant economic power. If you think about it, China has 4 times as many people as the United States. They have 1/4 of American living standards. Now, even if they are half competent, their living standards will rise, right? There are still a lot of poor people in China in rural areas. They will come into the city, they will advance. And as the living standards rise, the size of the economy will rise. So I think my judgment is that China will be number one. That if you get as far as, say, 2050, you will have 3 economic superpowers, the United States, China, and India. The European Union, I don't know. If the European Union becomes a solid bloc through closer unity, then they are also there. But at the moment, the European Union is still too fragmented. And of course, the British, as you know, we left. A bad decision that we have. So I think the answer to your question is the likelihood is that China will become the number 1 economy, but they do have these serious problems in the short run.
But what should we do to strengthen our relationship with with China in case of Taiwan? Because Putin supports China, and the way of relations between China and Taiwan, like he supports, in this case, China, and Ukraine supports Taiwan. So.
Yeah.
It's a difficult one because, sorry.
Mike, yeah, it's okay. Just to use mic. My answer is, as I've spoke out in my presentation, is first to get China now engaged in anti-war coalition because of many grounds and options: economic, political, international, United Nations, so far so on. But not alone. With the European Union as our partner, with the United States as our strategic partner, and with other let's say, superpowers. To be on the same page, not to let Putin, as you mentioned in your question, to use ties with China, to use China against us, and thus survive during this war, and thus getting more money, even in yuans, but spending them to kill us, to kill Ukrainians. Not to let it happen in a Putin's way. Make it, and all possible efforts to make it in our way, international way, with the civilized world. So that is my answer, what to do now, and how to do.
It's quite difficult to convince him because he is interested in economic issues or something like that, not in our lives. He doesn't care about our like Ukrainian, I don't know.
You mean him, Mr. C? Or
Mr. C.
Mr. C. Let me mention you one thing, not interrupting you. I remember my last visit to Beijing as a deputy foreign minister of Ukraine, very young, maybe like you. But same time, economic agenda for China was and is number one. And who is the biggest trade partner, trade counterpart for China? The United States. And for the United States, who is the biggest trade partner? Yes, China. See, that is the key. How to use it, how to get an advantage of this situation for Ukraine. This is a task of Ukrainian diplomacy, Ukrainian parliament, not to be excluded, and again with very wise and reliable international partners. All together, we can do this. I do believe.
I just add one point if I can. I have friends in Ukraine in Holos party, right? They're liberal, same party as mine. And they are very exercised about Taiwan. Because Taiwan, it used to be a dictatorship.
But it's now a very good democracy and very successful. So they say the Chinese demand for Taiwan to join China is the same as Russia demanding Ukraine back, right? It actually is very different because we don't recognize Taiwan as a separate country.
And it's not sovereignty.
It's not the same. But nonetheless, you can understand that liberal, free people who like freedom identify with Taiwan's position. And for the Chinese, this is their red line, right? They say, no way. You know, if a country recognizes Taiwan, that is the end. It's an act of war, almost. In fact, the Chinese are very pragmatic. A lot of the big investors in China are Taiwan company. Apple, which is the biggest company in the world, makes its computers mostly in China with a Taiwanese company. And there are people going backwards and forwards the whole time, but the Chinese are very dogmatic that no country must recognize Taiwan as an independent country because that is aggression against them. So for liberal people, this is a real dilemma. Do you support a democratic country, or do you respect the Chinese obsession with this is ours? Yeah?
And Ukraine did not recognize Taiwan.
No, not just Britain or even the United States.
So probably we will have the online speaker also talking. Mr. Xin Zhang, I hope I'm telling right the name. So probably after this we can also have the questions now even to 3 people. So please, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, super.
Very well. Can you hear me?
Yeah, super, great. Please, you can start. We can see your presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Myself or someone on the end is running the slides for me?
Yeah, we are running the slides on our end.
Oh, okay. Right. So, thanks for the organizers to have me. Partly because I think the internet, so I didn't hear very well the speakers speeches. Unfortunately, I get some of the questions from the audience. Sorry for that. If I'm going to repeat what the speakers already mentioned. So, at the request of the organizer, I will say, make a few quick points about the context of today's conversation. So, the first, I think, some general context where we are. First slide, where we are now. I think we are in an increasingly politically divided world. Geopolitical competition on the rise. And to some extent, there's a real concern we might be back to a new Cold War, depending on how you understand what the first Cold War was. But we do see an increasing division between different countries and blocks of countries, like today's event title, Transatlantic, right? Transatlantic is one way to think about the formation of the world. So to some extent, we do see partly driven by the ongoing war in Ukraine, unfortunately, a reconfiguration of the transatlantic world, we might call the West, and with different formations of the non-Western world. And China has been one part of this non-Western world. And in these different blocks of countries, again, unfortunately, I think we do see the play out in the international relations study we call security dilemma. So each one try to increase its own self security, but the other parties look these actions as essentially a threat to their own security and will react accordingly. So then the two sides are stuck in this escalation. And the results is, I think, between China and US, for example, very clear securitization on both sides. Right? Even in those areas that used to be completely detached from security concerns now are being drawn into this securitization process, even some parts of our everyday life. And that's happening on both sides, for example, between China and the US. Right? And then in this large geopolitical confrontation or reconfiguration, the two most active theaters, we might say, one is in the Europe theater right now, the other is in the Asia Pacific. Right? And what happened between them also, there seems to be increasing synchronization across these two theaters, and which is of direct concern for China and for China's possible attitude towards the war in Ukraine, towards any possible post-war settlement. Right? And then a lot of discussion in the West is, in this context, look at the behavior or policy choice between Russia and China, and to see whether there is any parallel or possible parallel between them, and for one to detect what may happen for China's future behavior following the predecessor of Russia. And I think these are some of the context we are in right now. And then just some maps. For some people, this is the world we are getting to, or more specifically, this is where we are getting to, increasing clear block formation and geopolitical rivalry for two major blocks. Again, this is just one vision. We see. I don't completely agree with that, but that's one result that we're getting to. And if people do have this kind of assumption that sometimes the world may be getting to what this presumption actually is driving for, right? Self-perpetuating tendency can be also there, which is a dangerous direction. There's some different visions of where the world is getting to. China's overall vision, at least until very recently is predominantly economic-driven vision of the world, and the Chinese state has a very clear, ambitious plan to bring a reconnected Euro-Asia continent, represented by some of the grandiose economic initiatives we see in the past 2 decades. Much better connected the Euro-Asia continent through various kinds of both physical and non-physical connectivity mechanisms. Here represented by some German think tanks for the description of this connected Euro-Asia continent. And also, next one was the corridorization. That's clearly stated in the Chinese official documents how Euro-Asia continent might be better connected for better economic collaboration across this whole continent through different corridors. And the next one, the China-Europe freight train routes is one recent physical representation of this idea, how to better connect the Euro-Asia. In that map, this Euro-Asia, China-Europe freight train routes already, part of it already goes through Ukraine, all the way from the east end of Asia all the way to through Ukraine, partly through Ukraine, and all the way to Europe. I think this is what a slightly different vision, in contrast to the very geopolitical division we see before. And then one very last map, in the middle corridor, if the slide goes as planned, you see the middle corridor idea of Europe-Asia connectivity. Part of the central corridor that goes up, the northern corridor that's supposed to go through Ukraine now, of course, are under some setback, mostly because of the ongoing war there. So there's a recent re-incentivized interest to further expand this so-called middle corridor going through the Caspian Ocean, Black Sea, all the way to Europe. So the point I'm making is the ongoing conflict or war in Ukraine in the economic sphere also has a direct impact on China's own economic initiative to better connect the Euro-Asia continent. Now, in this context, as some of the speakers already touched on, there are a lot of subtle issues, policy dilemmas. And if I may go to the very last slide, I was asked to possibly make some proposal to China. I think one is I would encourage the Chinese state and also different Chinese actors to really think of the prior relation between China and Ukraine. Overall, that pair of bilateral relations was on the very reasonably good status for all through the 1990s, all through the first decade of 21st century. China actually benefited tremendously from its relation with Ukraine, even including its defense sector, right, and agriculture. So Ukraine also, I think, benefit from intensified economic collaboration with China. Despite the domestic, for example, political changes within Ukraine, that kind of relation more or less was maintained at a reasonably good level. Right? And that piece of fact, I think, should be more highlighted within China for all kinds of Chinese actors. And then I would suggest to the Chinese state to increase direct humanitarian aid to areas affected by the war, to people that are devastated by the destructive war. Right? And then I would suggest in official channels more clear and straightforward condemnation of U.S. war, uphold the non-nuclear, non-proliferation principle, even more clear, strong message to uphold these principles. And then also more clear, straightforward condemnation of destruction of both grain supply chains and also other supply chains caused as a result of this ongoing war, it's devastating negative consequences for not only for the world market, but particularly for those vulnerable people and the vulnerable economies around the world. I think there's still room to do so. And also one point I didn't list here is I think I would suggest both to the Chinese state and also different type of Chinese institution to actually send more people to the area affected by the war. I think it's a risky proposal, but I think journalists, reporters, they should be more active involved in reporting from the front line and also those areas that are directly affected by the ongoing conflict, the ongoing war. I think this is something Chinese state and especially most of the official agencies seem to be very hesitant to do. But I think there needs to be more and also maybe a little bit diverse reports from the ground, from the area that are under direct immediate impact of the ongoing war. And the last one, and maybe a audacious proposal. In my individual proposal, of course, may not have much impact at all. But I personally do think this it might be a good idea to facilitate some sort of meeting between the Chinese leaders and the Ukrainian leaders at a appropriate diplomatic setting in the near future. Something that has not happened yet, but I do strongly suggest this is something that can be done and it should be done too. Yeah. Okay, I probably spend more time than I was assigned. But thank you for your attention.
Question to you, dear friend. Actually, here in Ukraine, we see, and not only us, but also many NATO member states, especially in the north, that Putin reduced weaponry and troops from NATO-Russia borders and moved it into Ukraine. That means, in many senses, that Putin himself does not view NATO as a genuine security threat. So my question is there any information about that in China, among people like you, about latest Putin's decisions?
On this point, I think there is sufficient information for example, for the expert circles, and there's not a big dispute on that. But I don't think in the official channels, the news coverage or reporting of the events, that kind of fact or information was widely reported or widely spread or widely used in debates on how to perceive the ongoing war. So I think I don't know whether there's a systematic screening for that information, but I would say for the general public or the particular information channels through the official channels, that kind of fact you just referred to probably is not referred as much as we, as among the expert circles, have received.
I know many companies moved from China to India and another country, relocate his виробничі потужності, industrial, yes. So in just a general question, what happened in 2025? Maybe war or maybe something else? Why many companies moved from China? And the second question is local.
Sure. Yeah. Second question is local in Ukrainian. So many companies too move and new project don't.
I can't hear you. Sorry.
Okay, it's bad. But so.
Still, I cannot hear you. I'm sorry.
Я розумію, але
This is a general question.
Yeah, this I can hear this voice. Yeah.
And now you can hear, yes?
Yeah, yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, strange.
without microphone.
What happened in 2026 maybe will be war, and why so many companies talking and start moving from China and more investment in IT, investment in India and other countries.
Yeah, I think this is a real scenario. It's one of the real scenario, and even before that, before the date you set, we do already see some so-called de-risking or decoupling efforts by some of the investors in China. I think that's part of the reality. Some of the companies now in China are already willingly or unwillingly take on this China Plus One strategy. Right? They have to prepare for two sets of infrastructure, two sets of system. One still based in mainland China, but the other may be moving to set up to Southeast Asia, Latin America, or back to their home territory as the sort of plus one parallel structure. So I think this is an ongoing process. If there is a large geopolitical conflicts, I think that will be even further exacerbated. I think this is a real scenario. I don't know whether Chinese decision makers are considering that, but that's a very real scenario. Of course, I think the part of the bet we see within China discussion is, of course, the de-risking or coupling causes damages, causes huge economic losses for all parties. Right? So whether current, for example, investors or business in China from outside of China are willing to take on these risks, I think there's a bet that most of these investors may not be willing to take on these losses. But again, this is a big question right now for both the political decision makers, but also for business to calculate how to handle this huge risks that are still not completely clear. Its scale are still not completely clear. I think the economic integration of China into the world economy, especially with U.S. and a large part of U.S., including a lot of the U.S. strategic allies, the degree of integration is much higher than probably Russia with some of the Western countries. So any geopolitical confrontation that leads to such a complete decoupling would be an economic, I think, disaster for all parties involved.
Could I just add something? The first is the two words, right? One is decoupling, and the other is de-risking, right? The Western countries, particularly the United States, have accepted that decoupling from China makes no sense, because the economies are so close together, so integrated, there is so much benefit, you cannot decouple. But they want to remove trade relations that are considered risky
that have some implication for defense. And some of this movement out of China is part of this philosophy of de-risking. Because if you are a big multinational company, the big risk is that something bad happens, maybe by accident, you know, a plane is shot down, you know, by some accidental thing between American, Chinese armed forces. It's not deliberate, but, you know, then there is a lot of anger, maybe sanctions are introduced, and this affects your business. So Apple and these countries are de-risking their business from the possibility that the United States may introduce sanctions at some point in the future. The second point about risk, which we haven't discussed, is that Trump could win the next presidential election. It's a real possibility. Biden is very old, he's my age, too old. He should have retired, over 80. And he's very unpopular. So there is a real risk that Trump comes back. And if he comes back, he has said very clearly he will not support you in Ukraine. He wants out. And also he may pick a fight with the Chinese. So, you know, there are some big risks, and some companies, of course, are now trying to factor these risks into their business models. And the two I've mentioned are very real.
Very easily. Let me set up next month in October meeting with you guys and Agricultural Committee of Verkhovna Rada, and please use this opportunity to describe them, to tell them what you can do and where our, let's say, parliament could be helpful, useful for you to support you by any legislation you think necessary and possible. Let's do it in a very simple way. Give me your, let's say, email or something, and I'll let you know. Again, in October, the next section we're planning at the beginning of October, and then several times during the October. And I'll ask guys from Agricultural Committee, MPs, to meet you and your colleagues and hear to your whatever inventions. Thank you.
Chinese economy, and what should we do to improve better relationships and cooperation with they to help us to enhance Ukrainian economy, and how we can interest them.
Well, first, you already have trade, huh? They're a big market for grain, agricultural products, and they need those things. That's the number one, and they're very important. I think second is to be open, supportive of inward investment here. They're not as risk averse as Western companies. Actually, they will take risks. They will say, well, this is a country with a war, but no matter, you know, if it's a good business, we do good business. So you could attract inward investment from China, but you have to be careful because they will take advantage of weaknesses. I spoke to one of your senior government people yesterday who said there was a very bad experience with a helicopter factory, Zaporizhia, and the Chinese company was up to some tricks. So your officials will need to be very careful in watching it, but providing you do that, I would say to their companies, yeah, you're welcome in Ukraine, and providing it doesn't affect our national security, bring your capital, help us with, you know, infrastructure, rebuilding the country. But the trade is fairly simple because you have things they want, you know, food. Yeah.
Thank you.
I thank you very much for having us today here. And my question to you is also energy-related sphere. And question is, you said about green energy. And in your point of view, can China use energy sphere, green energy, as instrument influence on UK? As well as on EU countries.
Yes, China is a paradox because they are the world's biggest polluters, but they also have the biggest solutions to pollution. They're by far the biggest carbon emissions in the world are from China because they burn a lot of coal, but they also have a very advanced renewable sector. So part of the problem, part of the solution. I think the big question we face in Europe, and I think this is true in Ukraine, is that China is now becoming the biggest car company in the world, right? It used to be America, then Japan, then and Germany, now China. They produce more cars than any other country. They're green cars, they're electric cars. And in the next 2 or 3 years, there's going to be a big crisis in Western Europe, particularly Germany, because lots of Chinese cars, green cars, will be coming. They're cheap, good, but there are millions of workers in Europe making old-fashioned type of diesel and petrol cars. And what happens to the workers? So you can see that a big battle coming up over that question. Also, the Chinese don't just make electric vehicles, they also control the supply of the metals that make the batteries. You know, lithium, special metals. They 10 years ago, they saw this problem coming. So they started investing in all these precious metals, and they now control the world market. So there's a danger that they have a monopoly control over these green technologies and they exploit them. But they have the technologies. It's a question of what our priorities are.
Okay, I have no questions, but I have the answer to the question of Mr. Vince. You asked us whether there is a direct threat from the side of China or we should cooperate with this country. On the one hand, China is one of the biggest economies, and it is very developed country, and and we should cooperate. But on the other hand, there is a danger that this country supply Russia with weapons. And I think that also this country on the official diplomatic level didn't condemn the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And you also say that there will be elections in the US and that there is a risk that Trump will win the elections, and also it can have impact on our country as a result of these elections. And the US may stop supply us with weapons. So the question is clear. We should cooperate with China because there are a lot of factors I have said first. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you very much for your presentations. And so my question is somehow connected with the answer that was just before me. So as I see for now, Ukraine is heading on the politic of Ukraine-USA cooperation. And so as it was mentioned in Mr. Cable's presentation, so now the new Cold War is on its peak, I would say. So my main question is about if we are starting a cooperation with China, will that somehow affect our cooperation with USA? So it's for all of the lecturers. What do you think about this point? Thank you.
Well, I think we the two of us have actually a similar analysis that there are threats and opportunities both. Actually, I think the reason I'm very unhappy about the new Cold War with China is it's partly economic, the trade, but that's not everything. The second reason is that we share the same planet, right? There are certain problems that we have to deal with. We've just talked about green climate change, pandemic management, rules around artificial intelligence. Now, if the Chinese don't cooperate on these things, then we have an awful future, because it means that there is no global way of dealing with these things. The world is split. So we have to recognize that they are important to work with. But it's got to be without illusions, because, China is very autocratic, quite very cynical. As you say, they didn't condemn the invasion. They don't act out of sentiment, never, or morality. Morality is nothing to do with it. Everything is calculation, hard calculation about power and control. Nonetheless, there are things you can do with them, but they're not nice, But sometimes you have to work with people who are not nice,
And if I may, just briefly, I like very much the suggestion of Mr. Xin, and I, even as a diplomat, would take as an agenda of Ukraine-China relations, those, I think the slide was like proposal to China, but I call it suggestions, like Ukraine-China relations. And I do recommend to have a look on them. That's very, very fine and very comprehensive from my point of view. Thank you.
Any other questions? We tried to take the last slides. Maxim, you can show them from, yeah. The last. Yeah, this one. Okay. It's our action plan. I think there's a potential deliverable as
So, thank you for coming. I'm glad to see you here. And so, I'd like to ask you, from your point of view, are China and the United States doing everything possible to support Ukraine? Or are China and the United States still competing, making Ukrainian lands a so-called battleground between superpowers? Thank you.
Yes, it is true. You know, there is a real risk that this is happening. I suppose my bias is that, you know, Britain and the United States have always been very close, right? And the Americans have supported NATO to support Europe. So if it comes to a choice, if you have to choose A over B, we have to choose the United States. That's our position at the moment. But we should do everything we can to keep open of not being sucked into a war. And I think those 5 proposals is a very good way forward. And I would add one other, which is the issue about nuclear safety. The Chinese really worry a lot about nuclear safety. They are the biggest nuclear power in the world. They're building many reactors now. You know, they don't want some explosion in Zaporizhzhia or something. They're terrified.
I totally agree, and in our interest, Ukraine interest, not to get this Cold War colder. This is nothing good for us, and nothing good for US and for China economies. Maybe politically it's another game. And one more thing, I think those who know the answer to your question met a couple of days ago at Malta, where Mr. Sullivan from the United States and from China, Minister for Foreign Affairs, had talks about what we can guess, but I do hope it was about us as well, about this war against us as well. So that's good sign, but let us see.
Any other questions?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I've got one more question. So I'm now representing the medical university. I'm studying medicine, so I'm quite far from politics, I would say. But I'm quite an active citizen. I was volunteering a lot, and I have my own non-governmental organization. So my question is that, what can I do as an active citizen to make relationships between, I would not say between China exactly and Ukraine, but maybe what can I implement to better connections of Ukraine, international connections of Ukraine? Of course, we can spread information about Ukraine, but maybe something more. What can you suggest? Thank you.
Well, the first, I think, probably is to try to get the Chinese to help with humanitarian assistance. I was today with a lovely person who is as a charity in Ukraine. Maybe you can explain it. And they're trying to create mobile hospitals for the military here, but wider application, and it's humanitarian. It's not aggression or anything, and it's purely medical assistance. So if you can get them to come up with some money for that, that would be a very good step. I think the second point I would say is the more scientific cooperation on medicine, physics, the better. Just as an example, when the COVID pandemic started in China, the Communist Party tried to conceal it, did a lot of damage. But because Chinese scientists were working with Western scientists, they gave the material to do DNA testing, to do the genome, break the genome, which led to the vaccination. So because you have cooperation scientist to scientist, not just government to government, you can achieve a great deal. And if you can get involved in collaborative research projects, that is a very good step.
Zhang Xin, did you hear the question?
Yes.
So how can we cooperate as an active citizen in China? What is the best way? In Ukraine.
Yeah, I think maybe a few things that come to my mind. One is individually, one can probably facilitate some of the Chinese civil, I would say civil activism in Ukraine too. I know actually a few cases of in the Chinese citizens who study or work in Ukraine, arrange donations, and also more direct live reporting from Ukraine as part of possibility to expand the coverage of the reality on the ground, right? But those are mostly individual activity. I think as you, as a Ukrainian citizen individually, if you get into touch with these people from China, your individual help, support for them might be also of some critical value for them to continue to do what they do and possibly even expand. And in the future, if, for example, what I suggested, China should send more journalists actually to report from Ukraine, particularly those areas that are affected by devastated by the war. If that in case that does happen, I think some direct support from Ukraine's citizens in the field can be of also very good help. And also another not necessarily suggestion, just idea is for those of you thinking of studying, continue your study or try to broaden your horizon from a very longer perspective, it may not be a bad idea to think of maybe study in China. I have quite a few actually students from Ukraine. I'm advising one of Ukrainian students for her master's thesis. So it's also a possibility, and in the long run, it may both broaden your horizon, also get to know China a little bit better, but also in the long run may be of some value for you, any individual from Ukraine, to play in the long run, play some role in facilitating collaboration or mutual understanding between China and Ukraine.
But unfortunately she apologized that she cannot come, and so we have a replacement, Andrew, but he's not coming too. So I think we can continue this event. So thank you very much for coming. If you want more events like this, you can write me, so like on the Eventbrite. So you receive email from Eventbrite, you just reply to it and if you have suggestions of topic that you would like to have, or suggestion of other type of activities, like you said, it's a very important question, how to contribute to make this world more peaceful and more fair. So especially in Ukraine, there's a lot to do. So don't hesitate to
And can I, as a host, I just wanted to ask one question to all speakers, but it's for me is also interesting about China is getting on the sanctions a lot. China is a manufacturing hub to the whole world. What industries and should Ukraine focus to be competitor to China and create its own manufacturing hub for Europe? Here, close, with good delivery, with much lower price, a little bit bigger than in China, but we could substitute them. Do you think it's possible And what industries could you maybe think as the main industry for manufacturing in Ukraine?
I don't think you can. Well, let me say first of all, I was responsible in the government, the UK, for what we called an industrial strategy, which is what you're talking about. But you can't just say, okay, in our country we want industry A or B or C and start from nothing. It's possible if you are China or Korea, because you have 20, 30-year planning, you maybe can do that. But in a democratic country where the parties change, the government's changing, it's much more difficult. I think the point I would say is that you can't create freestanding industries in a country like Ukraine or the UK. It's being part of international supply chains, and what we're doing in the UK is establishing electric car factories with batteries. But we know the batteries will come from China. Some of the metals will come from I don't know, Korea. Ukrainian industry will have to be built up in that way. Also, don't just think of manufacturing. The growth activities of the future will be based on IT, artificial intelligence, information-based, which are not factories. They're basically service industries. And you already have a lot of very good Ukrainian talent. A lot of people working in London, they've run away from here and now they're in London building up software companies. So actually, I think what I would give top priority to is having a very good infrastructure for information industries. That would be my priority. In other words, very good fast telecommunications, very good educational institute concentrating on these advanced new information-based technologies. That's where I would start.
Okay, Zhang Xin, maybe you would have some other opinion.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So if the same question, I think I agree with information, IT sector, information sectors. I think is holding great potential for Ukraine. I've met a lot of Ukrainian youth. The human capital stock for Ukraine youth is really impressive, including some of the students I taught in China. On the other sectors, I think from a Chinese domestic local economy perspective, there's actually quite a strong demand to establish a longer, more extensive production chains beyond China's national boundaries, both for economic reasons, cost-benefit reason, but also for reaching out to a larger market from a pure economic and a technical sense. That's one of the reasons, for example, Belarus, China-Belarus economic collaboration, its signature project is an industrial park, and China has some reasonable, successful experience of establishing these industrial park. And I also know recent successful cases of these industrial park in Russia. Leave besides the political competition story aside. Just look at the extending manufacturing and supply chains across borders. Those industrial park in different shapes in the former Soviet economic space are actually growing, and I think that the Chinese actors, both the state and companies involved, actually take it very seriously, are really looking forward to the possibility to extend that. So I think it's a shame, to me, it's a shame actually that part has not developed that well for Ukraine for various reasons. But I do think if in the post-war economic reconstruction, if that chapter, we can turn to that chapter in the not too distant future, I do believe that this is also an area that both Chinese, Ukrainians, and also actors in the nearby regions can put resources to, can attach a lot of hope to, even in some of the traditional manufacturing or processing sectors. I think Ukraine is its land and natural resources, human stocks, human capital stocks there are holding a great potential for those sectors too.
Thank you. And the last question, I'm curious because Ukraine will have the biggest problem that will need for agriculture, for everything. It's demining of the territory. And when we talk to a few experts, some of them said that only China can make it within 17 years, only 10 years. So we need, they have all the resources to make it faster, much faster. The only country. Do you agree, and do you think that China could be interesting in providing services in Ukraine but not supplying goods? Because China, like from Russia, they are taking resources. From Ukraine, sometimes they also want to take the resources. But here they could provide services. Is it possible, the demining as one of the vectors for cooperation?
Well, what's wrong with supplying resources? I mean, food is, Australia has become a rich and powerful country by exporting food and mining products. Same Canada. So you're very good at farming, right? And it's so why not exploit that asset? And if necessary, adding value by processing the foods. But that is, in economic jargon, your area of comparative advantage, production, agriculture.
Yeah, no, but I know how the China do the agriculture. So when not in China,
well,
so probably there will be doing spoiling our soil as well.
There's a world price. There's a world price, and you sell at the world price. Yeah.
But the question was about demining of Ukrainian territories. How much could it be interesting for the China? Because it will, someone say it's 70 years to demine the whole territory. If we involve China, it could be much faster. Yeah. Could it be interesting for them and a good spot for cooperation?
I don't know, but yeah, you raise a very important issue about long-term thinking. Which of course they have, and in the West we don't have. No, it is a risk there, yeah.
Thank you.
That might be an opportunity.